And hi all, good morning for all of you who are joining us for the live webinar today. And this is Sally Chiu from Temasek Polytechnic, bringing you yet another interesting topic in the series of live webinars sponsored by the Singapore Training and Development Association, better known here in Singapore as STADA, together with the Center for Transcultural Studies at Temasek Polytechnic. Of course, the intent of all these live webinars is to create learning communities and to connect one another with new things that we can all learn together. For today, we have a very interesting speaker who's putting a new face to mentoring. And he is Mr. Emelo. He serves as the Chief Executive Officer and President of the Tribal Creek Associates, Inc. He has devoted much of his life to helping others learn and develop, and his passion for mentoring and helping people with professional development continues to drive his life today. And he has more than 25 years of management, training, and leadership development experience. He's a prolific author, speaker, thought leader on topics related to collaboration, mentoring, social learning, and talent development. He holds a master's degree in organizational design and effectiveness from Fielding Graduate University, formerly known as the Fielding Institute. His new book, Modern Mentoring, is now available from the ATD Press. And of course, a recent award winner of the 2014 Brandon Hall Award. There's much more we can talk about him, but the topic is so exciting that I'd like to leave it to him to share with you more about what it means to be mentoring today. Is it still the one-on-one that we are so familiar with? No, he has something exciting to share with all of us today. Randy, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sally. I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation and share my screen with you. I think it would be good this morning if we started off with a little interactivity with the panelists around mentoring. And so the panelists that we have gathered for this presentation, if you would, please respond to this question. If you had to choose one of the two mentoring paradigms listed below, which do you think would have the best long-term impact for your organization? Is it A, a more paired approach, one-to-one, that is advancement focused, that happens face-to-face and typically lasts for a year or longer, those kind of relationships? Or do you think B is a better representation of what would create best long-term impact for your organization? More networked, where people play both learner and advisor roles, where the knowledge sharing and the relationships happen cross functions virtually and in more flexible terms. So the relationships could be a shorter event, could last 2-3 weeks, or a series of months, or however long it needs to. So with that said, panelists, which would you choose and why?
I guess I'll go first. I'm used to A, and I think that's probably, I think I know the answer that we're looking for, but I'm used to A. I've seen a lot of good results from that, and that's what I've done most of my career. But I've come off a number of events recently where it's been more B, where we've seen groups together and it's less controlled, but at the same time, sometimes there's things that stick with people. So they talk to you later and you see that they're still chewing on the lesson they got 6 months back at something like that. So I'll say A leaning to B. How's that?
Yeah, it is not necessarily a clean right or wrong, but obviously we'll get into the presentation a little deeper as to why B might have a longer term impact, although A certainly is what most of us are used to. Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in, share your experience or your thoughts as to which might have the best long-term impact?
Okay, I'll come in. So similarly, like what Philip mentioned, for my organization, we are using A. It has been effective, but similarly with the younger workforce, B seems to be somewhat more palatable to them. Something that they prefer the virtual, the flexible. So I would say it's a hybrid, A and B.
Very good. Thank you. And we have, do we have a room of some younger students with us today? Which do you, when you look at these two paradigms, A or B, which resonates with you? Making a blind stab there.
Students, staff, any response to this question? What's your response to A or B?
Hi. I think A will be better because it's one-to-one. Then people will remember more. Yeah, that's right.
Student
Okay.
perspective.
Well, very good. Let's. I'm going to go ahead into the presentation a little bit, and I think, obviously there's no right or wrong answer. I'm going to talk about how organizations are beginning to blend and draw values from both A and B. So it is really an open-ended question as to which will have the longest long-term impact. If you're looking at sheer scale, B is going to have a larger reach, and you're going to be able to affect faster mobility of knowledge transfer. A is can be very effective, but it's also very labor intensive from an administrative standpoint, and tends to have it tends to affect only limited populations, such as high potentials, or you might get a little bit of formal mentoring while you're onboarding. But I think that hopefully we'll get into some broader application for the processes that might lead you to begin to believe that B is also has good viability for organizations. How you view mentoring is going to have a lot to do with which generation you come from. So as we look at the fact that there are 4 generations in the workforce, but the traditionalists make up, depending on your organization, is going to be between 4 and 7% of the workforce. So it's going to be a very small number. The baby boomers and through the millennials make up the bulk of the workforce. So let's just focus on them for a moment. I myself am a tail-end baby boomer. I was born in 1960. So I identify a little bit with this baby boomer definition of mentoring, which when I first got introduced to mentoring, it was about networking for success, or a way to connect with someone who was had visibility in the organization that could help me advance in my career. So really it was a way of getting ahead through creating relational connections. The Gen X generation came along, that the Gen Xers are now moving into the power seat in organizations. A lot of baby boomers are the resident subject matter experts, and of course are beginning to leave organizations and retire and move into the last phase of their life. And the Gen Xers are coming along behind them. So the way that Gen Xers began to use mentoring was more as a peer collaboration tool. So they used it as a process to quickly collaborate with peers, because from a global perspective, the Gen Xers tend to see themselves as a generation unto themselves, and they really trust peer relationships. And so mentoring and productive collaboration began to come into the workforce pretty strongly about 15 to 16 years ago. And that's when I began to actually work with some large multinational organizations to create global mentoring initiatives. And it was largely because at that time the Gen Xers were just coming in, entering into the workforce, and they had a different set of learning needs that were focused on rapid collaboration. Today we see the millennials that are beginning to move right behind the Gen Xers, and they're beginning to outnumber the baby boomers in a lot of organizations. And the way that they view mentoring is really as a collaborative learning exercise. And by that I mean that it is quite common for someone in the millennial generation to contact and ask 5 or 6 different peers their opinions before they go to their boss with a problem. And it's really their approach to learning is one of constant collaboration and constantly pulling and gathering the opinions of others around them and synthesizing their own solutions. And so because of that, we've seen the practice of mentoring begin to change and begin to shift. Now, the good news is, or at least my contention would be, and what I put forward in the book, Modern Mentoring, is that we really need a multi-generational approach to mentoring, because the baby boomers are still very active and very much in charge in most organizations, and they represent deep knowledge and expertise of your industry and your customers and your products and your services. The Gen Xers who are coming along behind them are being groomed to take over those seats of power and position, and the millennials need a lot of tooling and retooling in role and in process. And so mentoring can play a role for all these different generational perspectives. And we're beginning to see organizations go forward with a more blended, modern approach to mentoring that really appeals to everyone. This new approach to mentoring can be kind of viewed in this little graphic here, where I juxtapose traditional learning methodologies that's primarily built on classroom training, and where certified instructors or facilitators actually end up facilitating live classrooms, whether they're virtual or face-to-face. Juxtapose that with collaborative learning, which is what we're doing on today's call, which is global in nature. Typically, it's a networked activity where there are almost limitless possibilities to create different kinds of learning collectives or networks that can help facilitate learning across the enterprise. Traditional learning is typically seen as unidirectional, so it's through the delivery of a course, a program, or some other structured certification process. Now, traditional learning will never ever go away and will always play a highly valued role, but I've positioned the size and the shape of these two different paradigms intentionally to show that I believe that traditional learning needs to be right-sized, which means that we have to stop trying to get it to overperform. We should use it for baseline understanding. So when you're learning the basics about anything, it is typically best learned under tutelage or instruction. Once you begin to learn the basic building blocks, it is far more productive and valuable to learn from other peers who are already more seasoned and veteran practitioners. So therefore, we see learning networks, learning communities, coaching, mentoring, and managerial feedback that's more real-time plays a huge role in creating this more collaborative and generative learning environment. And I believe I have clients who, and maybe your organization is one of those organizations where you're seeing a rapid acceleration in the amount and types and varieties of collaborative learning that's beginning to happen within the organization, both structured and non-structured. So that's another misnomer, by the way. Collaborative learning isn't always just informal. It can be formally structured into learning cohorts. It can be driven intentionally around organizational and developmental need the same as a course or a program. It's just a different deployment methodology. Along with these two different paradigms, we see the emergence of different kinds of measures. So we're all probably pretty familiar with traditional learning measures that have to do with knowledge and retention of knowledge, and we typically measure course completions and how people test out on knowledge areas. Whereas collaborative learning, the success measures are quite different. It has to do with what are people doing with that knowledge and how are they applying the information. And so we're looking at things like people gaining speed to competence, and people collaborating and really beginning to measure who's sharing what knowledge with whom, and looking at knowledge flow and knowledge transfer across the organization, across barriers, as critical measures for the success of collaborative learning. So back to the panelists, if you would, what are some, and my assumption is most organizations that I'm aware of today are not fully, they're networked, or they don't have this more modern approach to connecting people and learning relationships. And so what are those, from your perspective, which of these elements are barriers that you're currently facing as it relates to enabling a networked learning relationships or modern mentoring in your organization? Panelists, do you want to chime in here? Philip?
Let's see. I mean, oh, go ahead. You first.
Philip from Golin?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were. I thought you were about to speak. That's why. I think, when some of it is technology for sure, because any organization of a certain size like ours, we already have a network learning system, and if it's not suiting the needs, getting that to move is a really big effort. And then I would say the managers don't get as invested. So I've noticed recently, by pushing on certain areas, I've gotten people to realize we have a learning portal, or to get involved in certain programs, and then it sort of cascades. Once they figure out it's there, then they start to do it a lot more. Peer depends on the content, to be honest. For B, if we have good content, it gets shared. Leadership support is there, and that I'm here, so I think that's okay. See, I think a lot of the times we don't get the manager level that can really emphasize it. So the teams can know that the resources are there, but sometimes they don't do anything with it until somebody says, "Hey, this is important," and then they all go do it.
So what I hear you saying, Philip, to summarize some of that, is that it's really, we're still in this cultural transition of getting managers to realize the value and the importance, and even the fact that these venues are available and how to leverage it.
Yeah, I mean, they're busy, and they don't often. It takes, you have to do the face-to-face with them to get them to see that this is going to have value to their teams.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So once they understand, oh, that's going to help my team, or we can align this towards what you're trying to do with the business, then nobody's really a barrier at that point.
Right.
Randy, I see Jack from Changi Airport ready with some response, and I also see Brian from South Korea, BMW, perhaps ready to respond. Would we allow them to respond now? Jack?
Jack?
Okay, so on my end, it's actually more on the culture is not ready for it yet.
We have one type-in response, Rizky from Indonesia. He says C, and I wonder if Brian, are you going to respond to this? Brian from BMW, South Korea.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Nice to meet you. I'm speaking from South Korea, BMW. Well, my organization has a lot of technician technician network, and when it comes to the this topic, network learning, and they really need the support from the some leadership about their skill and experience, and but they are kind of facing some difficulties in the barrier when they need to get, you know, um, some support or any some help, because they think they need time to get that experience, because this work area, car industry, really depends on the their own experience. So the managers and the leadership always said that the juniors need more time to experience it. So there's always a gap existing between, junior level and the senior level. So um, when it comes to a topic, I need some any some answer from, expertise. What could be a good solution for this kind of situation?
Thank you, panelists. I think as we go along, to save time, some of you can also type in your options and choices as Randy gives you the option. That will greatly help. Thank you. Randy, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Good responses, by the way. Let's jump into a little bit of defining, the practice of modern mentoring. Traditional mentoring, and I'll juxtapose it against traditional mentoring because everyone kind of has an understanding of how traditional mentoring works. Traditional mentoring tends to be more fixed, and by fixed meaning that it's either people who are co-located, or there's an expectation that they will meet face to face and spend an hour a month talking about the development needs or what have you, versus modern mentoring that tends to be much more fluid, that people can address it as they have emergent needs or as someone else has a need for their experience. They're simply available in a more on-demand fashion. Traditional mentoring also tends to be, again, limited to face-to-face or geographically fixed, versus modern mentoring where we see a total flip where most of it happens virtual, even if the people are co-located in the same building or even in the same city. A lot of times the virtual collaboration is much easier and fits into their busy work schedules. We've found many times in traditional mentoring, it'll take 2 or 3 months to schedule a 1-hour meeting to get everyone's calendar to line up, and all that valuable time is kind of going by the wayside, versus beginning to collaborate around immediate needs. And then finally, traditional mentoring tends to be more long-term versus modern, which has a more flexible term. And a question that I get a lot of times is, is this really mentoring? Well, it is if it's learning from the experience of others. That's truly the definition of mentoring. And it doesn't matter whether it's virtual or face-to-face. It all comes down to the relational bonds and trust, and one person sharing their experience with another, or a group of people sharing their experience with others who have need for it. So in my understanding, even though organizations have taken a limited view of what can be done with mentoring, I think if you take a broader view and open up how you think about the process, you're going to get a lot more value from it. Also think of how, if you open your mind to a broader kind of application for mentoring, how you might design it differently or how you might deploy it differently in your organization against different audiences. A lot of times what we found is if you just simply bring in technology and make it available, people by and large will not use it because they're not used to it and they don't understand it has to fit a useful purpose in their work life. And so what we found is that you have to attach it to all of your training and learning efforts, and you have to start beginning to think about training as a process and not as events that are deployed. And so having learning cohorts who come together, who experience events together, but stay together and continue to communicate long after the event about what they've learned and what they're applying and how those practices fit, is more of a modern approach to the practice of mentoring. And instead of it just being leveraged against career development, it can be used in a way that facilitates these kind of learning networks in the organization. I'm not going to get too far into the specifics on this graphic. I just wanted to show that, you know, typically mentoring gets put into a very small box and it impacts a very small percentage of the workforce, versus a modern mentoring approach where we have organizations. I have an organization right now that has over 90% of their organization engaged in this practice, and it's all because they've opened up their thought around what it is and how people should engage it. The benefits of modern mentoring are pretty self-evident, but for the learners, it's more of a way for them to tap into the broader experience of the organization for career development, to create their own professional networks, to increase their understanding about how things are done in other work teams or other parts of the organization, as well as allowing them to take the advantage of crafting their own career paths by connecting with other people who are practicing in areas that they have passion or interest in, to vet out whether that's a good, viable career option for them, and if so, what are the steps they need to take in order to have that kind of career mobility within your organization. And so your very best talent, a lot of organizations are losing that because they're not providing them the opportunity to network within the organization, to find their own path as their interests change over their career. So by and large, for the learner, modern mentoring is a very flexible way to facilitate enroll as well as future path development. For advisors, this becomes a sticking point. A lot of people will ask the question, a lot of people that I work with and consult with, is what's in it for the mentors or the advisors? Why would they engage in this? And honestly, our evidence has shown in our research, and I put some of this into the book, shows that mentors or advisors are actually impacted more significantly from a productivity standpoint by engaging in this practice than the learners or the mentees, because they typically have more experience and they're able to operationalize the understanding. And you really don't know something until you have to give it away. And so engaging, for instance, high potentials, a lot of times they're just seen as learners. But if you see them both as learners and advisors, because they wouldn't be a high potential if they weren't already high functioning. And so really putting more demands on them to share what they already know as they're gaining more experience makes more sense than to simply have them be protracted students for, you know, midway into their career before you recognize them as someone who can begin to advise others. So there's just a lot of core value for every individual in your organization to be sharing the experience that they have. And so a lot of times technical expertise, the younger generation will be up to their skills and capabilities will actually be more modern, and a lot of innovation is going to come from that younger worker. And so doing reverse mentoring and connecting, and them, you know, the entry level worker actually advising your current learning or your current employees around the new practices and skills that they've learned through their education process is really critical for organizations, and most organizations just ignore that. And they can't innovate themselves forward, and they can't figure out why. A lot of times it resides in the workforce to get that knowledge sharing going faster. It also helps for people to create a virtual reputation around their areas of expertise. And then finally, for the organization, there's tons of value in really addressing some of the key enablers for talent development. So beginning to create new metrics for understanding an employee's value as someone who generates, creates, and shares knowledge, and not just become a consumer of content. So with that said, here's another poll question. How far along is your organization in creating this kind of more modern approach to mentoring? And you may have different names for it, but that's just the name I put on it. And by the way, it's not just all informal, as I said. It can span from, supporting learning cohorts that support very formal learning or certifications, all the way to very ad hoc topical development groups. So if you would, let's quickly weigh in on this, and we'll get into some other material here.
Okay. Philip, you look like you're ready to respond. Can you?
Yeah, I just didn't want to go first every time.
You?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would say we're sort of a C to D, in that we have activities, we have approaches, we're looking at things to improve, but I joined this organization at the beginning of the year, and the role's kind of expanded to go to several PR agencies. So there's 1,300 people, a bunch of different companies inside that, so a lot of different cultures. And some of those cultures are really more in the A and B stage. A couple of the brands don't really have a plan at all. So I guess we're sort of like a C, let's say, solid C, some trending to D, and sometimes falling back to B.
We have a response from Risky. He is saying it's D or E.
Good, Risky.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Jack, you look like you say something.
Yep, I think for us, we are currently at the B and C. Obviously, we have the solid, I mean, in terms of the traditional mentoring, we have at the E stage, but in terms of this modern mentoring, started to form certain strategies out, piloting certain things to do as well, leveraging onto technology, helping with that. So really about B and C that we are in right now.
Thank you, Jack.
Very good. And I appreciate everyone speaking candidly about this. I would say out of the 50 different organizations that I'm working with, most of them are at that C-D stage, but they wouldn't be talking to me if they weren't a little further along. I can tell you that 5 years ago, almost everyone was at A-B stages, and a few were at C. So it is beginning to progress. It is becoming more normative for organizations to get more experience with this, and there are new best practices coming forward all the time. At the end of this webinar, I'll share some information with you, but I have a new article coming out in CLO magazine where I'll be talking and writing about a client of ours that's creating a certification process to create, get their managers more involved in driving this. So it isn't just the learning professionals, but really driving it from the employee base out. Those things are helping to push it into the final stages of becoming kind of an enculturated practice.
Randy, I have a response on this from Catherine Chu from the NTUC First Campus, the head of learning and OD. Her response is, we are at an early stage piloting mentoring. The challenge we are facing is that this is new to us, and while we have experienced management staff in the organization, we do not yet have a robust structure in mentoring.
Yeah, and thank you, Catherine. That's a very common position for organizations to be in, and no one should feel bad about this. As I said, I've been helping organizations with mentoring cultures for the last 15 years, but it's really taken a hold of, doing more with it outside of traditional mindsets and beginning to push the boundaries of what can be done with the practice is something that's happened really with velocity over the last 4 or 5 years. So it's still a very young practice, and we're all kind of learning, and that's why I think conversations and webinars like today are so very important to get us sharing information about what's happening. So from that perspective, let me share some benchmark understanding of modern mentoring is really around creating personal learning networks. And each individual, we've learned some things. We know that the size of a really effective personal learning network is between 8 and 15 people in strength. So you may be connected in multiple kinds of learning groups or one-to-one or small group relationships, but typically 8 to 15 of the people that you're connected with, you're going to have stronger ties with. And that just simply means you're going to have a deeper level of trust, and you're sharing around vulnerabilities or difficulties that you're having increases with people that you have deeper trust with. So you may be connected from a weak tie perspective with 40 or 50 different people, but there's going to be 8 to 15 that you have, this learner advisor kind of dynamic going on where you're advising or you're taking advice, or those people you seek out to get critical advice in those personal areas or professional areas of development. And you're sharing that more personalized information. So you're just not sharing safe information. You're typically sharing that information that shows some personal vulnerability. Also the shape, we know that effective personal learning network or modern mentoring network is going to span typically locations, functions, and generations. And that's very typical. So getting outside of the current work team that you're in is pretty important. Once your quote-unquote time span of discretion gets above 30 days, which means that you're planning things out into the future, you really need to start, because the decisions that you begin to make at that point begin to impact other people. There's a lot of unintended consequences. So if you're not connected to people outside of your immediate work team, it's very possible that you're making decisions that are actually hindering others. And so getting this broader perspective is really important. And then finally, the quality of this network needs to be very flexible and fluid, meaning that you shift out mentoring connections as your roles and responsibilities and interests and demands change. So those people you connected with 6 or 8 months ago, those relationships actually start to get hard from a knowledge sharing perspective. You stop sharing generatively and you start really talking about things that you already agree on, and discovery begins to diminish. And so keeping this learning network fresh, bright, fluid, and relevant is almost a constant activity, like tending a garden. And real quickly, some of the different roles from your perspective, how are you going to enculturate this? How are you going to roll this out into the organization? Well, I'm going to just quickly lay out the differences between a traditional approach to mentoring and a more modern approach. So instead of someone who manages the training environment, you become more of an architect of these learning networks and these learning relationships. And you do that by instead of doing everything hands-on and doing all the recruiting, the training, the matching, the monitoring, and assessment of satisfaction, you begin to do promotion of the process, engaging more senior business leaders in your business lines around the productive value of these processes, of creating content and activity, learning activity. So actually generating the groups and stimulating the development of these learning interactivities, monitoring and then gathering business intelligence. What are the kind of productive values that are coming from these are all things that we see the new modern mentoring coordinator doing. It's a much more strategic role than a traditional mentoring coordinator. And of course, we see a larger pool of impact. Let me quickly lay out this model as you consider how ready is your organization to do more with this process. You need to consider these elements. And it is quite common. For instance, I was talking to an organization that's a Korean organization just a few weeks ago, and they identified that they have a very creative and imaginative culture, but they have an abundance of hierarchy that's strongly siloed, and they were also technically diverse. And so you get this combination of resistors versus receptive elements for this kind of new modern mentoring in an organization. And we don't have time to get into this, but I would ask you to consider how ready is your organization based off of some of these indicators. It's just a judgment call as to how ready you are versus how receptive you are versus how resistant you are. And if you're like a lot of other organizations, your organization is probably going to fall out between B and D somewhere. And the good news is that the approach for beginning to do more with this modern mentoring really will work regardless of how resistant you are. You just have to be careful of a couple things. First of all, if you start too small, you won't prove anything. So if you go to your formal mentoring program and begin to start modernizing it, your senior leaders already expect learning and knowledge transfer to happen in that mentoring program. So you're going to have to go and fix a business problem. So fix something important. For instance, we have an organization that is right now retooling their whole engineering core to go from desktop engineering to mobile application engineering. And they're doing that using modern mentoring methodologies. We have another organization that's reinventing their whole sales methodology. And they're beginning to take on a more challenger sale methodology, and they're retooling their whole in-field sales force through modern mentoring. So they're actually learning while they're out and delivering their new services. And so the idea is that you can use modern mentoring to fix important and critical business problems and address business initiatives versus classroom training, which tends to be too slow to deliver in the moment. And then, of course, you need to show results. So with that said, this is kind of the end of the formal presentation piece. Hopefully you have lots of questions. Please check out the book. You can buy it right there through the STADA organizational website. And I think, Sally, I think I'm at the end.
Thank you.
I just want to mention I'm also going to be at the ATD Asia Pacific Conference, and I'll be doing a session there. So if anyone's able to come to Taipei, October 1st through 3rd, I'd love to see you. Thanks.
And just to add, ATD is the new name for the former ASTD. We have questions, and I want to thank Ms. Lau Wai-Yun from Regional OD Manager from General Insurance. She's been waiting for a long time. Questions have been sent in. Question for Randy. You talked about generational preferences. In your experience, are there cultural preferences?
Yes. So obviously there are cultural preferences. We've actually seen the best traction with modern mentoring in locations like China, Asia, as far as India, and some of those some of the cultures that traditionally that would be more resistant to more traditional mentoring are more open to a more modern approach to mentoring. It really depends on some organizational kind of education of the management core. to give more permission for people to seek advice outside of outside of a strict supervisory role. So I guess in there are some cultural flavors and nuances to the practice of modern mentoring. But I would also say the research that I used for the generational views is a multicultural assessment. So it's not a North American perspective on generations. It really is looking at global research on the archetypical generational behaviors. So hopefully that helps a little bit. If you have some specific cultural references, I might be able to speak to them. Our system, the River software system, is translated into 11 languages and literally used all over the world.
Well, Yuan, if you're on, we'll wait for you to type in your response to this. I will take another question from Jack from Changi Airport. His question: the younger workforce sees the traditional mentoring as going to the expert to get the answer, seek their advice. Is there a negative impact to the organization if that becomes the norm?
To help me, a point of clarification: if the younger generation constantly goes to the older generation for advice, is that going to
be a negative impact to the organization?
Yeah, in the sense of, I'm going to read into that a little bit, in the sense of undermining the supervisor or the middle manager.
So what I'm trying to say is that with the model that we started with the traditional mentoring, taking a more prescriptive approach, the collaborative becomes the bigger so-called the way to go forward. What I'm worried, of course, is that is the way for us to get information, for a way to get things moving. Then that will only go to the traditional mentoring if they need expert advice. Do you see that in when you work with organizations, something like that? Is there any negative impact, or that it's okay?
It's okay. That's what we've learned. So the first web-based mentoring system I created was for Dow Chemical to deal with the fact that they had a critical loss of Chinese engineers. They couldn't keep the Chinese engineers. They became a feeder system for their competitors because there was a perception that they couldn't advance in the organization. And so they thought that if they groomed and used traditional one-to-one mentoring and connected a junior Asian engineer to a senior Asian engineer, that would fix the problem. What I suggested is, let's open it up to all engineers and see what the learner chooses. And almost inevitably, the learners wanted to connect with Europeans and North Americans because they intuitively understood that they were the ones who were in charge in the organization, and they wanted to understand and get advice from them so they could advance. Now, again, this was almost 20 years ago, so things have changed radically. Well, the concept plays out that, according to andragogy, the learner is always in the best position to make the choice about who they should be connecting with in what form or way. That's the core of andragogy. The learner always intuitively knows. What we have are systems that don't make it easy for them to make good choices. So if you create better systems to help them make good choices on who's willing and who's available, then I think there isn't necessarily a bad choice. So there are some young people who they want a one-to-one mentor because they want that career advice. They want that person to guide them over a longer period of time. At the same time, they want to connect with a fast-moving group of peer learners to understand about emerging topics. And so the idea is that we need to create learning organizations that allow for both and honor both uses of the process. Does that help at all?
I was very specifically looking at, especially for the more senior people in the organization, do they feel left out at the end of the day?
Sometimes we've seen that. So again, they still get used for formal mentoring. So formal mentoring will never go away. You'll always use that for high potential and succession planning purposes and those select programs. It's really everyone else who doesn't get to participate in those programs that modern mentoring is typically focused on.
Okay.
So how do you open it up for the ones who aren't eligible as the rising star?
Okay.
And we also, so there are, I'm going to share a couple other statistics with you. When we opened these processes up, we thought that everyone would run to the senior expert and we would overwhelm them. The reality is that most people realize that they're going to go to the most relative resource. So again, if it's to do with kind of a modern technology or a modern practice, they're going to go to a peer or a near peer versus going to that senior expert. If it's for political grooming or for long-term career development or advancement, that's when they're going to seek out that person that's 2 levels above them in the organization. But most people are intimidated and really don't want to talk to those people until they have something to offer or bring. I mean, that's the honest truth. A lot of formal mentoring that organizations do is what we call pseudo-mentoring, which means it's political posturing. People aren't really sharing what's going wrong or what's not working. They only get what I get from my kids when they were in college. I got what I call the A report. Every time I ask them, how are your studies going? They always just told me all the good things that were happening. And so if you want authentic kind of transformational sharing to happen in the organization, that's typically going to happen at a peer or a near peer level.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to compress 2 questions from Rizky from ConocoPhillips, Indonesia. His question number 1, can you tell the difference between coaching and mentoring? The second question, only few employees can see the benefit of mentoring. They much prefer classroom training instead to mentoring. Would there be any tips or campaigns to increase awareness and engagement? Over to you, Randy.
Yeah, the first question is much easier to answer, so let me try that one. Every organization has a little bit of a different value on coaching and mentoring. So when I say this, I also would acknowledge that if you see it differently, that's absolutely fine. But coaching is typically is a process where the coach is someone who's trying to increase someone's performance in a known area of development. So, for instance, that's why we call it, a coach. You have a swimming coach because they understand the right stroke that you need to apply, or a running coach who can assess the gait of your run and help you to adjust your body movements to get a more efficient gait. So that's coaching. Coaching is closing someone's performance against a known area. Mentoring tends to be more around releasing someone's larger developmental potential. So it's encouraging someone's more holistic development. Here's the reality, Risky. What ends up happening is mentors also coach, and coaches end up mentoring. So I would be careful trying to fully segregate the practices. It's really the process of sharing through the experience of others. And good mentors at times are coaching, and at times they're kind of giving that sage advice around career development, which is mentoring. Hopefully that helps. The second question, Sally, recap that one. I got caught in the first one.
The second question, Rizky's second question, only few employees can see the benefit of mentoring. They much prefer to have classroom training instead. How can we have anything done to increase awareness and engagement?
So you're probably not going to like my answers. First of all, you have to get rid of some of your classrooms. So you're going to have to switch dependencies. The reality is if you create more options, people will continue to do what they've always done long after it no longer works. So other things to do is combine both. So what we found is that if you want to create more connected and collaborative learning, you have to start the learning in a virtual environment, then have your training event, and then have your pull through with a learning cohort on the back end where people are applying. If you have a training event and then you say, we've created this community site for you to go collaborate on, people will never do it because they don't see it as a process. They see it as an appendage, something additional that's optional. So I would say start looking at the way you're architecting your learning and begin to blend your practices. And I would say in every case where you don't need to physically be in a classroom, do it virtually through learning cohorts asynchronously, and get used to creating short video training that's 3 to 5 minutes long that can be quickly consumed and quickly commented, and people can quickly share their experience as it relates to that practice. And just start re-architecting the way that you do learning that's more socially adept and more socially consumable.
I think we just have time for one question, and Hirin Pandya from Vodafone Global Enterprise Singapore has just connected with this question. How do you know if your organization is ready for mentoring? I think he's talking about modern mentoring. Randy, over to you.
Yeah, I'm biased, so I'm not going to. Every organization, unless there are a couple exceptions, unless you're in such a highly secret organization where people are not allowed to share knowledge, literally outside of their team, your organization is ready for modern mentoring. Now, how you go about beginning to create and develop and expand the value of the process is going to have everything to do with how receptive the organization is, meaning how progressive it is and how readily it adopts to new technologies. If it's more hierarchical and more controlling by nature, then you're going to have to prove the process to senior leaders. So you're going to have to pick important projects that that you can go in there and create rapid results that increase productivity. And if you're able to do that, then you will get more leeway from senior leaders to do more. And as I said, you're probably going to have to get outside of the formal traditional programs you already have in place because that's already expected. So go to the places where you're going to get a unique value, is my encouragement. Sally?
Thank you so much, Randy. I'm just wondering if anybody on the panelists have one final burning question, because we are a little bit short on time. And if not, there are many videos by Randy in the YouTube, but there is one article that I would especially encourage you to go pick it up, and we'll ask if he would give us permission to give you access to it. I really enjoyed his article on mentoring in a millennial world. There are so many nuggets there, and he wrote that article, I think, for the Chief Learning Officer sister publication, Talent Management. It's just excellent. With that, viewers, we regret that we need to bring this session to an end, and I guess tomorrow is for you and everybody on to see, hey, our organizations all ready for modern mentoring? And if not, what can we and what will we do about it? The video will be uploaded in STADA's YouTube account for your viewing. Just search for STADA and you'll find the video. We want to thank all our panelists, all our viewers for participating. Again, LinkedIn users, you can view this in the community spirit chat. And just to sum up and to take a little from what he said in the article, how do we put modern mentoring into practice? There was a study by the Welsh government made in April 2014 that 84% employees across generations are willing to use technology to share knowledge. And this suggests that entire organizations will be best served by modernizing mentoring programs to reflect millennial preferences. And of course, how can we all in organizations foster continuous learning through modern mentoring? Randy, we want to thank you for so generously sharing with us this morning. And for those who are interested to learn more on this topic, I'm sure you can connect with him, fly to Taiwan, and a lot more besides. The context for all of us to think about is how then do we create a working environment for modern mentoring to be successful? Because Randy has said, it is most successful when the entire employee base participates, creating that rich, cross-functional, cross-geographical, cross-generational approach to learning and development. Randy, we just want to thank you so much, and all panelists and all viewers. You'll hear from us in 2 months. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.